Welcome, everyone. Welcome to ICEP Insights workshop. Today's topic, Integrating Education Abroad into Undergraduate Learning, is brought to you by ICEP. And of course, I'll be introducing my colleagues, Betsy Brewer and Anthony Ogden as well, and some of the ICEP team members. As I think you all know, I'm president and CEO of ICEP Study Abroad. I see a lot of familiar faces, but also some new faces. While I miss seeing everyone in person, I think we all have discovered that the virtual world has created access, which is one of the ICEP core values for people who aren't always able to participate in our events. So it's really wonderful when we can see folks join who aren't always able to participate because they don't necessarily have all the travel opportunities. So it's great to see you all. Thank you all for joining. Over the last few years, some of you may have heard me refer to ICEP as a solution provider. As the world has become more complex and our membership has grown larger and more diverse, I think now spanning 60 countries, ICEP has also had to change. We've expanded and we've grown. We'll always be committed to our signature exchange programs, and that's what many of you know us as. But ICEP wants to be more than a method for moving students. We want to be more than exchanges. We want to be partners for you as you seek to create transformative education abroad opportunities for your students. At ICEP, we advise, we support, we convene, we educate, we share resources, and we do all of this through our member services team and our student support team. We offer a portfolio of global exchanges, of study abroad, intern abroad, and volunteer abroad, even virtual and hybrid programs. And ICEP can customize or tailor programs combining some or all of these program features tailored to your institution's needs. And I'm really excited about today's program, which grew out of an innovative book project that Tony and Betsy launched and was originally designed, I think, to be presented at NAFSA 2020 before the pandemic. Tony Ogden and Betsy Brewer are consummate scholars. They're friends for me, both personally and friends of ICEP. And our program today, Integrating Education Abroad into the Undergraduate Learning, really connects to my idea of building ICEP out as a true partner, as a true solution provider for global mobility. This webinar will help tie together what we've just been speaking about, how ICEP can really be a comprehensive partner for you. Because it's not about whether you have exchanges or direct or virtual or faculty-led or your own bilateral agreements. It's really about how do all of these mobility programs fit together? How do they make sense for you at your institution, whatever country, whatever language, whatever culture you're teaching in and educating in? How do these mobility programs fit together to support student learning and development? And so I think you'll see the model and the framework that we're sharing today kind of ties that together and helps you find a way to make sense of ICEP really as a way to integrate education abroad into your undergraduate curriculum. And next, I want to thank our sponsor for today, Global Ed Services. Our ICEP board member and treasurer, Stephen Connolly, and his business partner, Sandra Smith, are directors of Global Ed Services. This is an independent consulting organization specializing in international education that was established in 2013. It's located in Melbourne, Australia. Global Ed Services clients include higher education institutions, private education providers, and other NGOs, non-governmental organizations, as well as state, federal, and international government departments. And now I want to introduce our co-facilitators for today. Both of these individuals have worked with ICEP and been members of our community for many, many years. Betsy Brewer is Director of International Education at Beloit College with an MA and PhD in Germanic languages and literatures. A lot of scholarship there you can see and teaching experience. While she's worked at research-intensive institutions, she has an extensive experience at the Liberal Arts College, which is the American expression of our British heritage, of the college system that we inherited from the Brits. And Betsy has worked with ICEP since the late 80s when UMass Amherst was a member of ICEP. She was part of our group visit to Columbia. She's the winner of the NAFSA Simon Award for the way she has integrated education abroad at her college, at Beloit College. And she's helped really diversify the locations for her students going abroad, and also diversified the campus with the inbound students from ISEP Exchange. So it's wonderful to have Betsy with us, and Tony Ogden, who is managing partner of Gateway International Group, a new venture that he's created with a wonderful transformative suite of services that you can all go online and learn about. Tony has an MA and PhD in international comparative higher education policy, and a really vast research agenda. I don't know how Tony's able to publish as much as he does and do all of the other things he's done. He's also been a colleague and for ISEP at several member institutions, including the University of Kentucky and the University of Wyoming recently, as well as Michigan State. His teaching is focused on international higher education and policy, and you'll find his research published in many journals. And now I want to shamelessly promote their book, which I think is a wonderful tool, Education Abroad in the Undergraduate Experience. And you can get this book online on multiple platforms. And you have a link here. And we'll be sharing the slides so you can use the link. And there's a discount code for this. And I'll have Betsy tell you a little bit about this book project. But it's wonderful because if you are inspired by the webinar today, you don't have to take notes. You can get the book, and then you'll have this and more information there. So Betsy, I'll let you talk to us a little bit about the book, and welcome everyone again to our webinar today.
So welcome to everybody. I'm very pleased to see so many of you here. It's really great that this topic is of so much interest. And I imagine you might be puzzled by the picture that is next to my name on that the slide that John just talked about. And that's actually not me, it's Butch Bond, but he has an uncanny ability to frown and smile at the same time, and I do that. A friend of mine just took a picture of me on Sunday, and I had my typical, I can smile and frown at the same time. So that's the origin of Butch. Tony likes to have these other kinds of not our current photos. So our topic today is integrating education abroad into undergraduate learning. And this is something that is, I know, very familiar to you as ISEP coordinators and members of ISEP, because that's what you do. You help make sure that when students study at your universities or when your students study elsewhere, that their courses and their studies are integrated into their homeschool degrees. And I think you also play a really important role in doing what I think of as curriculum expansion. I think ISEP is a great example of that, where students are able to go to other universities and other countries in order to expand their knowledge of particular study areas and to learn in a different way. And I think that's a really enriching aspect of the ISEP network, and including, the new kinds of learning that John referred to, but also I had students doing ISEP internships this year, and that was really key, very powerful for them doing these remote international internships. So underlying the workshop today is this book whose cover you see here, and it was published in 2019 and took about 2 years of effort on the part of the chapter authors to put the book together. What I like about the book is that it brought in many different voices and perspectives into this discussion of education abroad and undergraduate education, undergraduate learning. And this is a topic that's really preoccupied me for 20 years, particularly when I arrived at Beloit College. That was my big challenge posed by the dean who hired me, and the hiring committee is, how are you going to make education abroad, study abroad, more impactful for both students and for the institution itself? And so I wanted to just mention a book that preceded this particular book. In 2009, I and faculty colleagues at Beloit College and Kalamazoo College published a book on integrating study abroad into the curriculum. And we discussed in the introductory chapter some theories about student development and student learning, and including, the developmental model. When are you ready to learn certain things in certain ways? But the majority of chapters offered examples of how faculty in different disciplines were either preparing students for study abroad or helping them to connect what they had learned back to their coursework when they got back, whether this was in capstones or in papers for their courses or different projects. And so in other words, the book was moving the discussion of curriculum integration to considerations of teaching and learning. And so the book that you see here, it takes a different approach, and I thought it was important to do that. And Tony was willing to join me in this effort. And this one asks a wide-ranging set of questions about education abroad and undergraduate learning. So chapters consider such topics as decolonizing education abroad, assessing learning outcomes, navigating the unfamiliar when abroad, connecting education abroad to careers, and other topics as well. And one of the first chapters in the book offers an overview of education abroad's evolution, something Tony is going to talk about this morning. Importantly for me too, in my 2009 book, all of the chapters were written by faculty members and by me as well. I teach, but I'm not a full-time faculty member. But in this book, we are also talking about the contributors are also other staff members. So just 2 years behind, in 2019 is just 2 years ago, but the COVID pandemic makes the 2 years seem like 10 years to me. And the final chapter in this book considers the future of education abroad, but the pandemic and also I think the increased attention to that is really necessary to social injustice and violence against people of brown and black skins has been really has changed our thinking about education abroad and really demands that we think about it differently. And I never thought that this would happen so quickly. We've learned how to do online work. We've learned to do alternatives. We've learned that sometimes this online work is better for some contexts, including, you know, being able to do a workshop like this without having to travel to another country or another state or elsewhere in our state. So I think that we're in a good position to be thinking really intentionally and carefully about making sure that education abroad is inclusive and equitable, that it transcends Western-only perspectives, and that it's mutually beneficial for all involved. And so we'll touch on some of these topics. So, but one thing that I want to say that has not changed despite the pandemic is that undergraduate education should give students opportunities throughout their studies to apply learning in different contexts and to connect and make sense of these. And so that's going to be an important part of what we discussed today. So now we'll look at our agenda for today. And these are the topics that we're going to be talking about. I won't read them all out, but we will be, I'll just point out that we will have 2 breakout sessions, and we're going to be really focusing in those breakout sessions, not so much on the formal curriculum, but on the other kinds of learning that students do that's really important as part of their studies, which is soft skill development and how we encourage that soft skill development. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tony.
Thank you, Betsy. And once again, hello, everyone. And thank you so much for joining us today. Especially thank you to the folks at ISEP. This has actually been a webinar 2 years in the making. And so we're so very glad that it's finally come together, and we're glad to be here with you today. I'm coming to you from Wyoming, so pardon me if I'm drinking coffee and so forth. It's still a bit early here for me. Now, just to pick up with where Betsy just left off, as you can see with the agenda, we have a lot to cover today. So we're going to go relatively quickly throughout the morning. And so I encourage you, if we're going too quickly, to come back and look at the slides or actually pick up the book and use that 20% discount that ISEP has generously provided. Now, just to sort of set up our basis for today, and as Betsy was just saying a moment ago, around this time last year, I remember having some very strong conversations with colleagues, some of you, in fact, where we were asking, will this pandemic be influential enough? Now, of course, we've seen it's been pretty dramatic, and it's changed or has at least appeared to change so much in higher education and as well as international higher education. But I'm still asking, will this be enough? In other words, will this pandemic and the other contextual forces associated with Industry 4.0 and so on, things that were already in motion, will this be enough to truly propel international education into a new era? I'm actually, one of my greatest fears now is that we are going to allow the spring sunshine and the vaccine to allow us to go back to the way things were. And I'm not sure that we collectively should and would want to do that. We can talk more about that as we go, but certainly things have changed and are changing. We do see here, for example, permanent changes in higher education in educational delivery. And it's not just how we deliver programming to our students, but also the types of the ways that we do it through modularized curriculum, micro-credentialing, and so forth. We also know that students still want to be engaged, but how we engage students is also changing. And in some ways, we're learning that certain things can actually be more effective being taught in a virtual space such as this than actually in person. We're also seeing, and I hope here to stay, are new technologies that are emerging that are allowing us, as Betsy and John both alluded to, that allow us to engage in new forms of teaching and learning. And all of these new acronyms like VR, AR, XR, it's all confusing me, but nonetheless, it's really changing the landscape of what we're able to do. And then also we're seeing greater attention and prioritization of justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this is really important, but it's not a new theme. Now, my hope is that this juncture that we're at, a juncture potentially into a new era of international higher education, will allow us to not just keep giving attention to diversity, equity, and inclusion, but actually really make progress and change rather than just keep doing the same thing we've been doing since 1993. Now, what we have also seen here in this post-pandemic world is that certain things really do need to be taught or delivered or engaged in person, such as graduation or sports, Greek life, and certain things really do need to stay in person. But a lot of other things about higher education and international education can be as effective, if not more effective, such as academic advising, mental health programming. My spouse is an academic advisor and is able now to meet more students than ever before. So it's an interesting way of working now. Now, over the past, since perhaps the 1960s, we have been framing student success in terms related to academic integration. The more students are academically engaged in their learning, the more likely they are to persist to graduation and be successful lifelong learners. Same thing with social integration. Now, my proposition is that I think will not just be social and academic integration that will be linked to student success as we go forward, but it's also going to be, I think, paired along with virtual integration. How are we going to integrate students in this new way of learning in ways that actually lead to new types of credentials, new ways of educational delivery, as well as a broader range and diversity of students. So I do think that we have not a limited path, but a much broader path that's leading us to new ways or next generation student learning. Now, long before, of course, before the pandemic, international education, higher education more broadly, has always been impacted by contextual factors. And as we've seen in the past 4 years, international student flows into this country and around the world have truly been impacted by politics and by the economy. Now, as we see, international education is strongly impacted by public health crisis here. And so what I've always said throughout my career is that what I did 5 years before is different than what I do now and will be different again in 5 years. So we know that this pandemic, yes, is changing us, but we've always had to be a very dynamic profession. And I think what we're going to be, I think now we're at a particularly important juncture, but we will always be changing. And so while this book that Betsy mentioned was published just a couple of years ago, one might say, well, things have really changed dramatically. Some things haven't. And the questions remain the same. And we're going to be covering a lot of those questions today. But first, let me ask you a question. This is our one and only poll today, but we thought we have to use a poll. And here you are now. So in your opinion, what are the major challenges to international higher education delivery today? So please go ahead and look over those responses and indicate what you think are the major challenges.
We'll just give everyone a couple of seconds here to answer the poll.
Thank you, Rory. As these, please keep responding with, it's very interesting. I guess I probably wouldn't have expected the most popular response thus far at 71% as cost to students. This has been a perennial issue really in international education, especially education abroad world here in the United States at least. And that is the cost of participation. Keeping in mind that we have been orienting, and I'll come back to this later, we have been orienting education abroad as related to students who are able to opt in to be able to participate, right? Now, I think in ways that we'll show later, there are other ways to avail themselves of international learning and engagement. Interestingly, in a virtual world, cost becomes less an issue, doesn't it? But it is still a big issue. And of course, health and safety is particularly present and prominent in our thinking right now and how we develop and offer programming. And then up here, budgetary cuts, which I would have probably guessed to be the first, because as we know, at least here in the United States, so many of our offices are being cut both via our annual budgets, but also in staffing lines and in other sort of operational costs. That said, I don't want to make light of the fact that these are difficult times here for education abroad world in particular. But I'd like to remain optimistic that we really have our best days are still ahead. And I'm really very excited about where we're going. And I hope that we're able to move there. So we'll come back to those thoughts here in a minute. But let me ask Betsy to come back to the book for a moment and really present our overarching theory around the book.
Thanks, Tony. Yes, I'm going to be talking about a model that we present in the book. So Tony, why don't you go ahead and move to the next slide? So thank you. So the model that you see here, we're trying to give a visualization of education abroad integration that acknowledges that education abroad can take place in many different ways and in different times during a student's education. And so this model was adapted from one that was developed at Beloit College by my colleagues in our Career and Community Center, Carol Wickersham and Charles Westerberg, who were seeking a way to help students understand how they develop over time and how at different times of their educations they become more ready and more capable of engaging with learning in different contexts. So a lot of their work was placing students in community organizations to do work. And so, and that was usually taking place in the junior year when students really had the skill set to do that. But we adapted this to our education abroad in order to think about how this applies to education abroad. And so on the right-hand side, you have learning outcomes, which are not just the disciplinary ones, but also the soft skill ones, such as critical thinking and social responsibility and problem solving. But on the left-hand side, we talk about student inputs, and that is what they bring. And we all know, I mean, that there's so much wonderful work being done now on asset-based approaches to education rather than deficit approaches to education. Of course, this has got its foundations in Dewey from the 1930s, but acknowledging that students bring much to their learning experience, and what they bring, their identity, their knowledge and skills, their attitudes, their social capital, all of that is going to influence the education that they have and their interactions with faculty members and fellow students. And so again, as I am showing here, the arrows going up and down also remind us that of what Lily Engel pointed out a number of years ago, which is, you know, how education abroad takes place and when it takes abroad is going to very much, and what the purpose is going to very much influence how students learn and what they're learning. I've had students this year doing remote internships as an alternative to study abroad, and I'm seeing really firsthand how the world of work and doing the world of work internationally, remotely, really poses some really wonderful difficult challenges for the students, but wonderful opportunities. And with practice, they get better at it. One of my students is doing a second internship, and she feels much more capable of doing it. William Newell has observed that students learn everywhere, that a disagreement with a roommate is just as likely to teach a student about conflict and conflict resolution as a theoretical text on that topic. And so in the model, as students move from their first year of studies through their fourth year of studies, they transition from doing things such as taking entry-level courses and engaging in co-curricular activities to finding greater focus. And ideally by the fourth year, they're able to connect their learning across ideas, concepts, and contexts in capstone projects and other kinds of project-based learning. But getting to this stage requires that they exercise agency, learn collaboratively with others, and reflect on learning. And then ultimately the goal is that they can transfer learning from one context to a new context, which we know is extremely difficult. So this concept of learning how to learn is really, really important, and the model is trying to show that. The work of moving from year 1 to year 4 and after graduation to transferring knowledge and skills is really difficult. It requires that students both value and question what they've learned in their academic studies. But on the other hand, concepts and skills and theories that they've learned in their studies may not fit neatly into the situations at hand. It also requires that students acknowledge what they don't know, and that can be very difficult and unnerving. But if they're willing to engage and to continue to engage as conscious learners, the outcomes can be very rich and powerful. Learning to be comfortable when you feel uncomfortable and out of your depth is a really major skill, and I think that's something that we can all agree on. So there are lessons for all of us here today. And one of those lessons that I really want to remind us all is that many of us on our college campuses serve in the role of educating students or helping to educate students. We support them in different ways. Learning and facilitating learning is not just the role of, it's not limited to just what faculty do. It involves many other people, including people abroad who are supporting our students, and even including people abroad who interact with our students but don't have any kind of formal role with them. Those are all people who are all contributing to our students' educations. And this is another reminder that depending on students' developmental readiness, educators may need to exercise more control over what and how students learn, or become more mentor, helping students to ask themselves questions, consider alternative hypotheses, and identify gaps. So in what they know and what can they do. So developing this kind of metacognition. So I'm going to ask Tony to move to the next slide, and I'm just going to briefly talk about some of the theories. So I talked about integrative learning, which of course is Dewey's work was foundational for that. And then Newell has done quite a bit of work on this, and the AAC&U has also taken up this topic of integrative learning and has a wonderful kind of rubric for understanding it. Another concept that is really important for us, those of us who work in education abroad, is self-authorship, and that is the ability, comes from Magolda's work, to collect, interpret, analyze, and reflect in order to form one's own perspectives. And then another theory is self-governance, which is that ability to connect and transfer and reflect. So it's really helping students to break down the rather false dichotomy between academic learning and the world of work. And then the final reminder about Engel's work on outcomes are being context dependent. So I'm going to stop here and turn this over to Tony.
Thanks, Betsy. So folks, please keep that model in mind, because we're going to refer to it again later this morning. So let me, if those of you who read the book know that the chapter 1 in the book really speaks to the growth and expansion of education abroad, at least here in the US. And so I'd like to pick up very, very briefly this morning on chapter 1. If you've not read it, I would encourage you to read it. I think it's a really solid chapter that helps to position everything that's happening today in its historical context. So let me just run through a few quick slides on that. Now, of course, we've all seen this graph here of showing the popularity, at least here in the US, of the number of total students earning credit through education abroad, and how it's increased pretty much year after year, except for this little blip here, but pretty much year after year for the past several decades. Now, of course, the total number is hardly representative to the total number of international students, total number of students in higher education in the United States, but nonetheless, the number has been growing steadily over the decades. Now, what's interesting is if you look back to where education abroad in its current understanding, it stretches back to the 1920s, essentially, where we got our early beginnings. And in fact, many of you have perhaps seen this photograph of a University of Delaware. Very interesting to remember that our universities were perhaps the first provider of education abroad programs to neighboring or consortia-based types of programs, such as, if this was a Delaware program, you see Syracuse and Boston and so on. But then, of course, the changes have continued, but it really wasn't until around right after World War II that we started seeing greater escalation and greater familiarity to what we now recognize of education abroad. And this is also around the time when IES, my former employer, CIE, and other national consortia were started, including NAFSA as well, our professional association. Now, and then of course, it was really around the 1980s that we started seeing huge, rapid growth in development from new providers to the types of programs that students were participating on. But still then, it was largely the junior year abroad students. Students were participating in one-year abroad programs, primarily in Europe. Now, around in the early 1990s, I think that's when ISEP was started. We started seeing greater attention to student services, such as more attention. It was 1993 when we had our first national conference. I think it was CIE that hosted a conference on diversity and underrepresentation. But at that time, the leading rationale started emerging as being focused on intercultural competence. And then around the turn of the century, we started seeing huge focus, of course, on standards. And this when we saw the establishment of the Forum on Education Abroad, the Code of Standards, codes of ethics, glossaries, and so on. So, if you look at it, we've had a long history, but we can identify very clear waves of development over time. Now, one of the other changes that has happened over the decades, in my opinion, is that initially back when we were doing primarily junior year abroad, it was really about go abroad, frankly, put on a beret, smoke a cigarette in Paris, and get a little bit of culture. That was sort of the focus of education abroad at that time. Learn a bit of French, pick up a little bit of culture. And that was the focus. But then as we started seeing a shift more toward short-term programming, shorter meaning semester programming, and other types of programming emerge, this is perhaps why we started seeing more of a focus, I think, driven by this emerging class of international educators than I think the faculty, but a focus on intercultural competency development. Now, these two driving rationales still persist today. And in fact, I might just plug here, I've been invited on April 8th, so do note this date, to moderate a debate between Milton Bennett and Mark Salisbury on this very topic, and that is the continued relevance of intercultural communication or competency development as a driving rationale for education abroad today. So it's going to be, I think, a very heated debate, and I'm preparing my debate questions now. Now, that said, over the last maybe 20 years or so, we've started seeing greater involvement among the faculty. Now, of course, that stands to reason because we have been standing on the sidelines as cheerleaders for many years now saying, if only the faculty would get on board. And well, now they are. And now they're driving more cohort-based programming, discipline-specific programming, potentially around the idea of engaging students in context learning, perhaps primary data collection. And then, of course, as well, we've seen huge growth in other segments of a standard institutional campus, such as the career services offices wanting to be more engaged in internships or service learning, as we see in student affairs, and so forth. So these rationales persist, all of them still today. And I think perhaps the undercurrent that drives any of these rationales is still, and of course, this is relatively new in the large scheme of things, and that is education to get a job or career readiness, employability. So this is still a very strong undercurrent, and it is a driving rationale for parents, for students, for stakeholders, and other stakeholders. So it is important to think about that. Now, of course, another way of looking at drivers is the standard 4, and that are, what are the political drivers that have shaped education abroad over the decades? What are the economic drivers? Or are there the cultural and social and academic? And these are typically the 4 drivers that we look at when we're analyzing or discussing changes to higher education over the decades. Now, when we look specifically at international education, these drivers become even more clear to me, at least. And that is, when we look back in the 1960s, of course, and we were focusing on the Sputnik crisis, and then we started seeing the foundation of what we now scholarship, but yet we still see considerable political attention given to the importance of our students learning in a foreign or languages other than English. And then we are also seeing, and have seen over the decades, an economic driver. And this, of course, today is heavily manifested with regard to career readiness. And that is, if students will study abroad and they learn about the world and they learn new skills and new knowledge, it will make them more readily employable and desirable to potential employers. And then, of course, cultural and social has been a long time driver. And again, as I mentioned earlier about intercultural communication, but I would argue perhaps with the growing popularity of the Carnegie classification for community engaged institutions, seeing more focus there. And this is perhaps one of the reasons why we're seeing international offices engaging their students in service learning. And as John mentioned earlier, the reasons perhaps even why ISEP has expanded to other modality types over the decades, because students are demanding it, but also so are our institutions. And then, of course, one would like to think that academic rationale is a strong driver for education abroad, and certainly it has been. Of course, we've seen and have been hearing for 20 plus years now the focus on integrating international education into the curriculum. Of course, we've also been seeing, and I'll talk a bit later this morning if time allows, on how we have positioned, I think very smartly, education abroad as a high impact educational practice that has the potential to impact student success. And student success in this case, at least here in the US, is defined really more in the scope of persistence and graduation rates. Now, of course, one of the other big drivers that I'm hazarding to guess really is around public health. And that is right now we see public health, in this case, specifically the pandemic, is really shaping all of our programming and how we engage students all around. Now that takes us to right before the pandemic. I believe in many ways, these are the 5 topics that have been really driving a lot of our discussions for a number of years, and in fact, still are. And that is first, articulating the value. We've all had been doing this in many ways with key stakeholders on campus, but how do we articulate the value to students? Why should they study abroad? Our goal isn't to get students abroad. Our goal is to use education abroad to educate students, right? And so how do we articulate the value, especially as in the discussion here about cost, given the cost equation, how do we balance that with the value to the extent that that's even viable? The second is about the shifting emphasis. It's no longer, I think it's no longer even ethical, frankly, to ask students where they want to go. That's not our job. Our job is not about sending students on trips abroad. Our job is really focused on more of the education, as I mentioned, and that really is focusing more, and hence the shifting emphasis away from destination-focused language to discipline-centered language. And then diversification, broadly defined, and underrepresentation has been a huge focus for us. Although if you look at the data, specifically by demographics, it hasn't changed much over the last 30 years. So I'm hoping with this juncture, as I alluded to earlier, will help us to look at new modalities, new ways of framing programs that we really do make international education in all of its forms as equitable and accessible to all of our students as possible. And then perhaps most importantly, as we've seen, and thankfully, the acceleration of the utilization of technology may allow us to explore, and I think it is, all new ways of delivery. And then finally, the new modalities that are emerging. It's so very interesting nowadays, you can't go to a single international event and not hear the word COIL. COIL's been around for a long time, but what's very, very interesting is that it's now, that and many other modalities are now moving to mainstream acceptance. So nothing's really new here, but the fact that it's becoming more mainstream. Just yesterday, John, I hope you're listening, because just yesterday I learned of something that made my heart go pitter patter, and that was this organization has created a multilateral course level exchange alliance. And I just think that's brilliant, where students can just take a course. It might be that they only need a specific course, and yet our systems and our structures in US higher education haven't really easily allowed that to happen. And so I'm just so excited to see all these different modalities. Now, finally, and by the way, I know I'm really speaking quickly, but I just want to make sure we have plenty of time for our breakouts. But I want to slow down for 1 minute here and really speak to this continuum that you see here. As John mentioned, I've been writing a lot over the last year, speaking about what I consider as this continuum of international learning and engagement. This is not necessarily a continuum for comprehensive internationalization, but I'm really speaking here about the student level of international learning engagement. As I mentioned a moment ago, education abroad is but one methodology. Our goal in response to this pandemic and all of the factors around it has not changed. Our goal is the same. How we get there is indeed shifting. And so over the past, as I showed earlier, that slide since 1929, I think we have viewed education abroad as the student as the primary unit of mobility. Meaning our goal has been really getting students to literally go abroad to or into a different intercultural context. That was the focus. And in that case, what we've done is we've leveraged education abroad as an opt-in. Basically, we make it available to all students, and those that have the good fortune to avail themselves of it, hence opt-in, that's been our focus. And what I say here, maximizing opportunity. And universities have done the same thing with other high impact practices as well, from living and learning communities to you name it. And so the focus has been getting students to opt in. Hope you're with me on that. Now, thanks to this continuum of learning engagement, we're seeing this mainstreaming of other forms of learning, and including virtual learning. Now, in certain cases, virtual learning is really taking off. In other institutional contexts, isn't. But nonetheless, what it is doing is it's expanding access to a new type and a greater diversity of learner. Now, what we don't want to do, and hear me loud and clear, if you remember anything I say today, you hear this, and that is, we don't want to set up haves and have-nots. Last week, I got a Google alert about an article where this university was referring to what I refer to as access education as the next best thing. That's a logical and educational mistake. It's not the next best thing. It's an addition to. And we don't want to let the modality itself drive our thinking. Rather, we want to let what we want our students to learn drive our thinking, and to use the modalities to frame that. And so, in other words, this isn't the next best thing, and it's not about virtual. It's about what I can learn in this space that makes this space relevant. If I'm trying to learn Japanese, I probably need to spend time in Japan. But if I just wanted to learn one specific element of Chinese mining technology, I may not need to go to China to do that. I might be able to do that virtually and be as effective. Hence, access education. And finally, integrated education. And this is where my heart is these days. And that is internationalizing our courses. And what I'm seeing here now are new players, new ed tech companies, new modalities emerging. And that is when a student registers for a course, irrespective of who that student is, by the mere act of registering for a course, they are going to find international content related to the focus of that discipline. So as here, we've been focusing on the student as the primary unit. I would like to think the next generation international learning is really focusing on the course as the primary unit of internationalization. So what this leaves us now here is with three buckets. Not one then another, but rather three buckets that we can now use strategically to engage our students in a robust array of international learning engagement, so that all students, not just the wealthy white girls, can study abroad in Europe, but every single student who walks across that stage and picks up his or her diploma will have understood, at the very least, the international nuances of their discipline. That's our goal. How we get there is changing. So with that, I'll step off my soapbox for a minute and turn back to Betsy so that we can put all of this into context.
So thank you, Tony, for that overview. I think, when you're talking about public health as being really critical to international education or health, I'd also add on my campus and where I'm seeing on other campuses, environmental issues are really key. They're very much on the climate change, very much on the minds of our students, and also human rights. Absolutely a critical topic, and that can't be ignored in international education. I'm going to take us in a little bit of a different direction with these two sessions that we're going to talk about now. I really value the idea that course level, that every single course a student takes is really important, and it's a great opportunity for gaining international perspectives in those courses on the topic, and gaining perspectives not only from the US or from another country, but from a diversity of voices, bringing discussing things. So I really do believe that is important, but I also would really make an argument that students really do learn in all sorts of different contexts. And that's really important, and that they, whether they're learning virtually or out of or in person, whether they are commuter students or whether they're students who live on campus, there are all sorts of opportunities for them to learn if we only help them recognize how that they are learning, or that they are their different contexts, and help them develop skills that are really, really valuable. So I'm going to ask Tony to move to the next slide. So I'm going to talk right now about, or ask you to consider this notion of learning by engaging with people and place, and how that in turn can promote soft skill development. And as you all know, soft skill development is very tied to career success. But I'd also argue, and I argue very strongly, that it's also critical to our ability to engage civically. I mean, we're members of communities. Our civic engagement really matters. How we vote really matters. How we talk to each other really matters. How we solve community problems, and then think about larger national or international problems. That's all kind of civic engagement. Soft skills are really important for that. Soft skills are really important for our personal lives. So I think soft skill development really it's really critical today, and it goes alongside of disciplinary learning. And one of the reasons I'm focusing here on soft skill development is because for a lot of us, and me included, my first question when I ask students when they're coming into my office to talk about education abroad, study abroad opportunities is, what are you studying? What interests you? What do you care about in your studies? But then the second question is always, and what do you care about in addition to your studies? Because that's going to also drive or give you opportunities for learning when you are engaging abroad, or doing virtual work, doing a virtual internship. That all matters. So soft skills help you build relationships and solve problems. They show you have the capacity to work with others in advance. So that's very much recognized. And the lack of soft skills is a problem in most workplaces. I mean, a lot of, over 50% of managers who are transferred overseas fail because they can't adapt to their new work and living environment. They don't understand why people do the things the way they do them. It's hard for them to adjust, but that also happens in the workplace at home. I think there's a statistic about 46% of employees having really difficulty because they don't have the soft skills that they need. And then we used to think of hard skills or disciplinary skills. Industry skills is the one that really matter, but we now know that soft skills are not just nice to have, they're actually absolutely critical. And you see that in the work of IIE. They've really been emphasizing that in their Generation Abroad initiative, and it's been brought in other areas. I do see language education and language acquisition, foreign language acquisition is really critical, but also even being able to use English and understand different Englishes and acknowledge that there are different Englishes both within the US and elsewhere is really important, and to be able to engage with that. So Tony, could you move to the next slide? So I'm just going to ask you here to just use the chat to suggest some of the soft skills that you think are developed during education abroad. So I see flexibility, critical thinking and problem solving, navigating new environments, self-advocacy, empathy, adaptability, patience, navigating bureaucracy, navigating ambiguity, grit, problem solving comes up a number of times, awareness of self, self-confidence, internal motivation is a great one, and understanding of ways knowledge is developed, initiative, humility, independence, yep, and intercultural communication, and then the subcomponents such as of that. Active listening, for which being able to actively listen and ask thoughtful follow-up questions so that you better understand the person. Yep. Okay. Thank you. Thanks very much. And you see a resource there on the competencies. So the ones here on the left-hand side are communication, organization, critical thinking, interpersonal communication, adaptability, creativity, teamwork. I like this one of decentering oneself is really important. You can't do teamwork unless you can decenter yourself. You can't understand others unless you can do that. You don't really communicate well if you don't do that. So on the right are the ones on the left that come from LinkedIn, and that's their standard set. And they're variations of these sets. So you can find 8, lists of 7 soft skills that are really critical, or 20 soft skills that are really critical. What I would suggest to you, and you've been doing this in the comments that you've been placing in the chat about soft skills, is that you also need to unpack these. And so communication isn't just communication. You don't, ask somebody in a job interview, are you a good communicator? And the person can say, well, I'm a pretty good communicator. That doesn't really tell you very much about the actual underlying, how that person, you need the evidence, right? And so unpacking the skills or these categories of soft skill can really help students provide evidence that they actually can communicate. So they can listen and communicate across difference of ideas, opinions, beliefs, cultures, backgrounds. That's something very specific. Or they can speak publicly, or they can communicate in more than one language. Or they can communicate effectively, verbally and non-verbally, which is really important. They can read other people's, body language, and their speech patterns or their silences. Americans are not always very good at silence, but silence is really important in other countries, or can be important in other countries. So I'm arguing that it's really useful to break these things down, because that helps students identify where they are in this. So let's go to the next slide, please. So I'm just going to argue here, and you can see pictures of kids doing things in different contexts, but very briefly, we learn outside of the classroom. And a lot of our soft skill development, it can take place during the classroom, but it's also very likely to take place outside of the classroom. And when you talk to your students who've come back from study abroad, what do they talk most about? A lot of it is these out of classroom experiences that have taught them enormously, that taught them that self-confidence, that ability to listen, that other people have different perspectives, to collaborate. Keep those kind of images in mind. Next slide, please, Tony. But there's some obstacles to soft skill development, and that's where this people in place. We know that soft skills develop often in relationship, in interacting with other people, but they also develop by interacting and navigating new places. But as you see on the left-hand side, somebody's trying to read a map. On the right-hand side, you see signposts saying confused, unsure, unclear, perplexed, disoriented, bewildered. I mean, that is very often the experience of students when they land in a new place. It's very often the experience when I take faculty abroad, that's the initial reaction. They don't know where they are, and they don't know how things work. and it can be very intimidating. So next slide, please, Tony. So I'm drawing here on work that Darren Kelly and Anthony Gristwood have done. They're geographers, and they talk a lot, and they think a lot about the work they do with students in London and Dublin on that to navigate new unfamiliar places, students actually need to be able to engage with themselves, understand themselves, how they need to be engaged with others, and they need to learn how to navigate space and place. So again, the obstacles are cognitive dissonance. We say, where am I? Why am I here? That's a number one thing. I find that sometimes when I've sent students to places where they think they're not going to have difficulty, they really forget, why am I here when things don't work well, or I don't understand why people in Ireland are not like me. I knew they would be different, but I didn't know it would be this hard. Insufficient navigational skills. So how do I get from here to there? How do I read these streets, these buildings, these people, myself? And then disengagement. If we get overwhelmed, we can want to hide. We can want to just, ask ourselves, where can I find comfort? And that, often reside, ends up when we're abroad in, these kind of subgroups developing of, the bubble, or the American bubble, or the international student bubble. Not that those are not altogether bad. We need to find places of comfort, but we also need to find those in order that we can re-engage. So why don't we go to the next slide, Tony? So I also want to remind you that being, kind of lost, whether it's emotionally or socially or geographically, is not it's not necessarily a negative thing, right? To be lost, as Walter Benjamin has said, is to be fully present and to be capable of being in uncertainty. One of the things that you put in the chat was being able to navigate unfamiliar environments, and ambiguity, really important. So to be lost is to be fully present. That's a great thing to be remembering. I also like this quote from Rebecca Solnit, who writes about, she's written a guide to getting lost, and she really doesn't mean just geographically, but also in other ways, primarily in other ways. But she talks about, children roaming around, developing self-reliance and direction, imagination, willingness to explore, and being able to get a little lost in order to figure out the way back. She talks a lot about kind of knowing how to get lost is a valuable skill. Let's move to the next slide. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about this again. I mean, you see this quote from David Starr-Glass talking about engaging with the stranger, the other, allows us to better understand ourselves and to learn from differences. So that's one of our goals. And the stranger can be the strange environment as well, or the strange institution, or the strange way of instruction. We're much better off if we, in those situations, can ask, how can I learn from this, than to reduce it to, this is strange. So I'm just suggesting a few ways that we can, on our campuses, help students, if they're going to be studying abroad, virtually or in person, develop ways to be comfortable with exploring unknown people, engaging with unknown people, unknown places, including the virtual space of international internship, and then this soft skill development. And I will say, for one of the things that my campus does to help students think about their engagement abroad is to put on our application, our study abroad application, they actually write a whole essay on how they're going to engage when they're abroad. And it has been really helpful to students to dig down in deep, think about this question of how they can be engaged, not only in their studies, but also in the life beyond their studies when they're abroad, and why. So we're going to go to the prompt for you. So I'm going to, I think hopefully we have 10 minutes to do this, but how can you or your office, organization, institution help students prepare to engage with people in place when they're abroad or doing virtual things, and through that developing soft skills. But I also would ask you to think just how you can do this on your campuses, because students develop soft skills when they play sports, when they work, when they have work placements, when they do internships, when they do club activities, and frankly, when they live with other students. 10 minutes for this, please. You're going to go into breakout rooms, I think. So thank you all. I think we were going to have the ISEP coordinators just give a very brief, like one sentence, take one idea that we got out of each breakout group.
I can go first. I'm Jennifer Gay with ISEP, and our group had quite a lot going on with both courses for preparing for being on program and reflecting post-program, some transcript designations for opportunities, a certificate program for global competencies so that there's more internationalization at home. Study abroad wouldn't be a requirement for that certificate. And also there was some discussion of potentially some issues with being able to sustain those courses when there are enrollment and budget challenges at institutions and the priorities get shifted.
Thank you.
I can go next. I'm Zach with ISEP, and our group, I think, had a chance to really talk about two concepts. The first being that, I think we've done a really great job of helping students when they've returned from their study abroad programs and thinking about the experience, but what are we doing both before and after, and making sure that we make this a continuous exercise and experience for them, and finding ways to engage them while they're abroad in particular, not just before and after. And then there was something that was brought up, which was great, which was related to sometimes it's counterintuitive because we want students to disconnect from their social media, we want students to disconnect from their virtual place that continues to keep them tied at home. Well, let's start to encourage folks to be engaged with social media in their local destination and find out what's being popularly used in their local destination and use that as a catalyst to get them into the community and to be communicating with local folks in that environment. And I thought that was really an astute observation that we should be thinking about doing that, even though we want them to disconnect to a certain extent to experience place, that's still a value. And that was an idea that Angela at University of Kansas brought up for us.
Yeah, that can be a really, one of my students at Beloit, did that wonderfully when he was in China and had a huge, wonderful supportive network as a result. Next.
I can go next. My name is Bailey, and we talked about a lot of different areas. We heard from Kirsten, who talked about how in the pre-departure process, they asked that students really dig deep into how they're going to be involved when they're abroad. So instead of just saying, I'll make friends, it's really kind of going more into how they will do that. So they asked for that in their pre-departure course. And then also from, Jorge talking about how he has seen that when students do volunteer work, they don't come back with the same soft skills. So really trying to have them engage in service learning opportunities where they can contextualize what they're learning and empower them to, when they come home, really get involved in their community at home as well after they return. So those were a few things. And just talking about, Lizzie talked about how she asked that all their students take the local language to ensure that they're really able to connect with people locally and learn that kind of skill of communication. So those were some of the takeaways that I wrote down from our group.
Great, I can go next. My name is Alexandra. So we talked both about what institutions do with their outbound students and what it looks like on the inbound side as well. So I think a big theme on outbound was somewhat similar to what Bailey mentioned, having students articulate specifically, whether that is their specific learning goals for their time abroad, both academic and personal, or having students identify how their identities in their home country might translate and be different or have different impacts abroad, and how kind of get them to think ahead of time about those pieces. And then on the inbound side, certainly building a baseline of that cultural understanding so that students can again contextualize what they're seeing and learning about on site, and then using news sources to expose students to current issues, make sure that they're kind of aware not only of the history, but current events, and also meeting students where they are in inbound and outbound, I suppose, in terms of communication. So, you know, bringing up those discussions in a WhatsApp group, if that's going to generate more discussion and engagement than, you know, currently having them on a Zoom or, you know, in person in a room, students might be less willing to share than they might in texting, in a texting medium, which they're quite comfortable with using in their daily lives to connect with their peers.
Thank you.
And in our group, we talked quite a bit about service learning and internships for incoming students. It seems that in Ghana and also in other places, we have government-sponsored that allow for students to take advantage of some of these opportunities, and they have taken advantage of these opportunities. Journaling, even though it's probably a little old-fashioned, it's still very relevant. Does seem to help students reflect a lot and develop the soft skills that they need to while they're abroad.
I can go next. We had an interesting discussion on how virtual learning might challenge the development of those soft skills that we were talking about, and we talked about the importance of place. No? That was one part of the question, and how not being physically abroad might challenge that learning. There was an example from the University of California of a course on how do they call it? It's a history course, but they look at different places on campus and the importance of looking at different narratives, or which voices do we believe, or how we look at different narratives, and the importance of helping students to do that, and how that could be also done virtually. There was also an example from Dominica, North Carolina, Dakota State, and she explained how they do this kind of three-phase, how they help students pre-departure, during their time abroad, and after they return, to kind of have that action plan to develop those soft skills, reviewing them in the middle of their time abroad, and then looking at that, have them develop the narrative to talk about those soft skills in a professional way when they are back, and sharing that or giving back on campus. That was a specific example.
All right, thank you, everybody. I really love all the different ideas and the different ways that you're approaching this work. It's really great to hear these different ways. We're going to go, Tony, why don't we go to the next slide now? And actually skip to beyond that. We're going to be talking about reflection now. And I'm going to argue that when you see this model, that one of the ways that students do all of this connecting across their education is through reflection. And so the more that we can teach students how to reflect and help them make that a regular practice and give them ways to do that, the better able they're going to be, the more conscious learners they're going to be, and the more they're going to be able to approach different situations as learners. So if we could go to the next screen. Then I'm just going to briefly review what reflection is. So what is it not? It's not ruminating, thinking, hashing over something over and over again. It's not just based on facts. It also involves emotions. How do we, it's not taking no lessons for future experiences. It's not touchy-feely. That's one of the criticisms or thoughts about reflection, is that it's just touchy-feely, but it's not. Next slide, Tony. So what is it? It's recalling and experiencing detail and objectively, to the degree we can do objective recollection. It's examining your experience of it in terms of both your kind of thoughts about it, but also your emotional response to it. And then it's identifying the implications of the experience for future experiences, whether in the same context or different context. So really, one of the things that I talk with students about is, this is a really easy example. You go on a hike, you don't wear good enough shoes, you don't have a good compass, you haven't really remembered to predict that it's going to rain. You get lost and then you come back really uncomfortable. You can do two things. You can decide, I'm never going to go hiking again, or you can say, okay, what went wrong? What could I have done better? How do I feel about that? If the result is I want to go hiking again, then you're better prepared. So next slide, Tony. So why is this important? It's important because, as I gave in that example, it generates learning from experience. It helps us become more aware and attentive. It deepens the learning. It helps us make connections among experiences, and it allows us to apply what we've learned to future experiences. So, and again, this is not something that we know, that we're born knowing how to do. Some of us are better at it than others, but it's something that can be learned, and it develops and improves with practice. So next slide. And I'm just going to show you this, we know this kind of cycle of learning, but it's very much, this is part of reflection, is part of this metacognition cycle where we learn, we're conscious of the way we're learning. Next slide then, Tony. So I'm going to be asking you to think about this DEAL framework, which is basically developed by Ash and Crawford, and it's talking again about description, examination, and articulation, what is similar to the way I was suggesting that we break down categories of soft skills so that students can better understand how they're developing specific aspects of those things. These questions under here, the sub-questions, are really useful to students. So, I think it's important for this one on description, for example, where it says, what did you and others do or not do? An incident just doesn't involve you, it may involve others as well. What did you see, hear, feel? I mean, it's very concrete, but the examination then is also, this comes from a service learning model, but or context, but how were you challenged? How did you feel about it? How did you think about it? How have your thoughts changed as a result? And then the articulation of the learning. So, and what does that learning matter, and what are you going to do with that learning? I think this is, in our discussion group in the breakout session, one of the points that was made from Costa Rica is that when you're teaching students about health in Costa Rica, it's not just to admire health in Costa Rica, it's also to ask questions about why that works, and what can be done in the US, and what can be, and what are the health needs of people from, all the different Spanish speakers we have in the US, the Latinx community, in all of its complexity. How do you better serve those people? And so it's not just studying something, but it's, what am I learning? I'm learning about health. What am I going to do about that when I get home? So next slide. And so these are just some of the tools or principles, which is you help identify learning goals and specific learning goals and objectives. So to think about in the reflection, you design your programs and activities to facilitate these, and then you incorporate opportunities for reflection. And you can see a variety here. One of the things that has been really important at my institution, where most of our students do direct enrollment, so we don't have someone on site helping them reflect or make sense of what they've done. Instead, what we do is an international symposium where students present on their studies and their learning when they get back. And that has been really powerful it's been a very powerful way of not just getting around the question of how many courses can we offer or how many students can we accommodate. This way we accommodate a lot of students who studied abroad who want to discuss their experience and make sense of it. Some very often in connection with their disciplinary studies, and sometimes more related to the soft skill development or some combination. So Tony, next slide. So I'm just going to give you an example of how I do this with students who've studied abroad, but also I've done this with students across the campus where they were talking about soft skill development in how they had done that in all sorts of different contexts. So while I focus in my work on education abroad, I also do some work at the college for students, and at my college we've developed a set of 4 categories of learning outcomes, and then subcategories of them that we want all students to achieve by the time they graduate. And so I've done workshops around that. One of the things that we do in that workshop is I try to let the students know that if you can tell your story of your soft skill development to yourself, you're going to be a lot better able when you go to a job interview to be able to address the question of, so talk about a time when you were challenged or you faced a problem. What did you do about it? If they've already gone to the work of telling that story beforehand, they're going to be much better able in that to be specific and demonstrate the skill. So in this case, this is the assignment that I give in my class and also in the workshop. And I also do this for students preparing to study abroad to help them understand that they already have developed or are developing a lot of these skills through all sorts of experiences on campus or in their personal lives, such as students going to their families' homes in Mexico and finding that they need to learn how to communicate in a different way. So in this case, this is a student who was writing about an experience going to a market, and she talks about going to this market. So she says that she finds herself very overwhelmed. She studied the language, but she can't really make sense. It's difficult to communicate despite having studied the language, and it's crowded and it's noisy and it's cold, and she just wants to get out of there. That would be the easiest thing for her to do, but she also wants to follow through on the purchases that she wants to do. And so then she kind of finds herself, okay, I need to focus. Why am I here? What am I trying to do? And how do I do that without being rude? How do I do that culturally appropriately and not in a disruptive way? And she then takes this conclusion, and this is, and she says, I apply that. This is actually from an alum of the college who works in public health. But she says, I apply the lessons every time from this market, every time I'm trying to bring my team together. We have very different political views, but we have a job to do, and we need to focus on a problem. And so that's what we do. So that's the assignment. And then she has identified over here, she was working on resilience, or what we call resilience, and professional agility and intellectual agility. And she's showing here, she persisted. It was an awkward situation, but she persisted. She problem solved. She grew more self-confident as a result because she knows she can go to the market and do this. And she learned how, and she was communicating. So that's one. Tony, next slide. And so then this is just another example, but I'm just going to very briefly say this is a student who studied at Goldsmiths, and she's interested in communication, and she talked about developing skills for communication and agility, but basically she talks about connecting with the study abroad office at Goldsmiths because she's interested in that as a career, being invited to speak at a networking event for study abroad advisors, being the only American there, and how much that taught her. She found herself developing a network. learning about the field and learning a lot about study abroad from other viewpoints. So we're going to go now to the prompt for the breakout session. And this time, I don't think we're going to have time to report out, but hopefully maybe the ISEP staff can put things, results in the chat so we can see them and have a record of them. So how might you help students reflect on their education abroad experiences, whether those are virtual or in person? So that's the prompt. Okay, thank you. We're going to join our breakout groups now.
Great. Well, welcome back, everyone. I hope that second breakout was interesting to talk both about soft power and reflection. I think now for this very last few minutes, and probably within 5 minutes or less, I really want to put this into context for why all of this matters. Now, for many of us, we've invested our careers and long careers in many cases in supporting education abroad for our students, whether they're American students or students from around the world, to be able to study and learn across international borders. Now, in chapter 3 of the book, co-written by actually me and by one of my former graduate students, John Hopt, we focused on this question of education abroad and student success. And frankly, going back to where I started at the earlier outset of this morning, talking about what is student success. And in many ways, this chapter refers to Ku's theory on high impact education practice. We all know a lot about George Ku and that work, along with some other organizations as well. But now, basically, if you look in the back to 1975, it was really Tinto that was really guiding the conversation, then Aston. Of course, these two theories are still very relevant and central to much in higher education student success discussions today. But Ku has really shaped the discussions insofar as it relates to education abroad programming. Now, if
Tony, if I may interrupt for a moment, are you intending to share your screen in the PowerPoint?
Well, I thought I was.
I cannot see it. Can others see it?
Well, can you see it now?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Carlene. Golly, I was sharing it with myself, folks. Anyhow, so there we are. So education abroad and student success there. Here's the two slides, the slide I was just mentioning with regard to Tinto and Aston, and then now bringing it more recently to George Ku and AAC&U. Anyhow, these are the 10 educational best practices or high impact educational practices that George Ku mentions. Now, the central question, the one that's been related to a lot of the research that I've done over the recent years, and then which is the question that informs chapter 3 in this book, is can education abroad as a high impact educational practice be leveraged effectively to enhance student success? Now, we have seen a lot of correlation research over the years. And so let me be very quick and introduce you to the CASI research. If you're not familiar with the CASI research, do a quick Google search here in a minute with CASI, and then you can look it up maybe in reference to the University System of Georgia, which has hosted this 3-year study. Now, this is a massive study, and with more than almost 40 institutions around the United States, many thousands of student data points in this research. So not enough time, obviously, today to go into it. But in short, what's particularly impressive, and in answer to the question, can it be leveraged effectively? Is education abroad a causal high impact educational practice? Well, according to this massive study, multi-institution study, the answer is, looks like it. And what I mean by that is, when in this research, what we're not doing is, we didn't just do some correlation research, but in fact, what we did is we didn't even do a regression. What we did was matching analysis, where we match students within the same institution on a number, I think it was like 12 or something, different points, to try to make them as similar students as possible. So with all things that we know to impact graduation rates or student success broadly defined, all things being controlled, so to speak, that you can see here on the screen now, and I am indeed sharing the screen. You can see that students who study abroad compared to students who don't, all things being equal, do indeed, at least in this large sample, show increased graduation rates. What's also important is, according to the myth that's been plaguing us for several decades now, it's not slowing time to graduation. It doesn't require more graduation credit, and it's not hurting your GPAs. Here's the link that you can look at later. But what's particularly important about this study for today, and we started out talking, Betsy did, about the importance of access, inclusion, and inclusion. If you look here in this study, the findings are pretty robust. And by the way, there are a number of publications that have just come out. I've already submitted several publications as lead author as well, based on the CASI data. But you can see Black and Hispanic students, again, all things being held equal, do have higher 4- and 6-year graduation rates compared to Black and Hispanic students that are not studying abroad. This is important because, again, as we started out earlier saying, we want all of our students, every single student, to engage in an international learning, at least within their discipline, whether it's, in case, of course, this data is all both based on mobility-based education. But that said, the findings are very robust. Then if you look at need, we talked earlier at the outset of the conversation about cost. If you look at those students who have need, demonstrated financial need, those students who do so, that study abroad, indeed have 4- and 6-year graduation rates at 9, in this case, 4 years, 9, almost over 9 percentage points higher graduation rates than need-based students that do not study abroad, all else being controlled. Pretty fascinating. One of the papers I published just recently was just looking specifically at first-generation college students. And this was some chatter in the chat about that earlier this morning. As a first-generation college student myself, I was particularly keen to see these findings. Look at that. First-generation students who study abroad versus first-generation students who do not, all things being controlled, over 11 percentage points more likely to graduate in 4 years. And they're not just graduating 4 years, they're actually doing so with higher GPAs in less time, and so forth. These are really robust findings. Now, what's most important, though, in turning back now to George Koo's high impact educational practices, in his research back in 2008, he said that it's really important that it's not just to participate in a high impact practice, it really is important to reflect on that, as well as to engage in other high impact practices. And according to the NESE research back in 2016, the latest data I could find on high impact educational practices, we know that students are not just one and done, they are actually participating in more than one high impact educational practice. So as in the model that Betsy showed a couple of times this morning, when we look at that 1, 2, 3, and 4 years, depending on where your educational system is, it's important for students to reflect and to build and to further leverage or avail themselves of these high impact practices. Now, we're in a new age. And so now we have to ask new questions. And for me, this slide here I'm about to walk through is so very important. We have to be very strategic now of not just casting a net and seeing who can opt into studying abroad, but rather we need to now map. If we believe in the model that we showed earlier, if we believe in that and we think that makes a little bit of sense, then we have a duty rather to then map international learning and engagement across the undergraduate experience. We need to ask the question, who? How can we how can an increasingly diverse learners have a sense of belonging, meaning to see themselves participating in some form of international learning and engagement? What program types? Again, education abroad is one broad umbrella with program types, so many program types. ISEP is the leader in exchange bilateral and multilateral exchange programming. What is this program type? How will you be able to leverage that for certain types, at certain points in the undergraduate experience or other program types? And then what degree junctures, when? Now, we know some majors would prefer students to study earlier on. Others would like to see them study abroad later on. So when do you want, how are you going to map it to the degree? And then where? And this is a new question, isn't it? Where? In other words, what context? Is it going to be mobility-based programming? Is it going to be virtual? Is it going to be course level internationalization? Where are we going to leverage international learning engagement? I think we have to free ourselves from this over-reliance. Of course, it's been 70, 80 years of a reliance on physical mobility. And not that that's bad, of course, that's really great, and it will come back. But we don't want to lose sight of these other modalities. So hence we have to continue to ask the question of where. And finally, how? How will you, or let me do this, how will you partner with ISEP to support your international education goals? ISEP's been around a long time. They're an incredible group of people. They have a wonderful program modality that's changing and adapting with the time. So how will you look into your own portfolio? How will you partner with ISEP? Now, with that accolade there to ISEP, let me turn it back to ISEP and ask Dr. Lucas to come back in and wrap us up today.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. Thank you, Betsy. And thank you to the ISEP team for helping out here to facilitate. Alex, Bailey, Joey, Jennifer, and Zach in the United States, and Teresa in Ghana, and Maria in Barcelona. Of course, thank you to my friends, Tony and Betsy, for sharing this with you. I think we've unpacked a lot, and there's maybe more questions than answers, but that's always good at ISEP because there's going to be more opportunities to engage and to further unpack all of what we've learned today. And think about, what does all of this mean for your context in higher education in the post-pandemic world? How can we take an education abroad integration model and begin to work with that on our campuses and in our various contexts? We've had a brief overview of the growth and expansion of education abroad and next generation learning. What does that mean for ISEP? Our Council of Advisors is working right now on a faculty virtual mobility model. Taiwan, Italy, and the United States, they're going to be presenting in the next ISEP Insights on a model like COIL that was referenced. And so what does the next generation look like? Virtual, hybrid, and of course, in-person engagements. How do we add value to undergraduate education? The soft skill development that we began to look at, and the role of reflection. How does that happen in a network of 60 countries, 350 institutions? How can we help the students to engage with their soft skill development? Is that as a host institution that you will help the students? Is that as a home institution when they come back? Can ISEP play a role in helping facilitate while the students are on program? These are topics that I want to continue to explore with all of you through forums like this, through the conferences that we attend virtually and in person, and other ISEP events. And of course, ultimately, what we're trying to do is help to guarantee that students will use education abroad, maximize the use of education abroad to guarantee their success, that they have quality experience, that they avail themselves of the high impact practices, they graduate on time with the skills, both the hard skills, the scientific skills, and the soft skills, the people skills necessary to be successful in a complex global world. So I want to thank, again, Tony and Betsy for sharing. Without the volunteer expertise that we have in the network, ISEP couldn't offer all of these things to such a wide group of folks and not have to charge for it, which we don't like to do. And that's thanks to having scholars like Tony and Betsy who are willing to spend time with us today and share their knowledge and expertise and volunteer that. So thank you both. You have their
Sorry.
That's okay. And feel free to get in touch with Tony, with Betsy, with us at ISEP to continue this conversation. We will make the slides available. We will make the recording available, and we hope to continue the conversation with you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Day, afternoon, or morning, depending on where you're at.